Well, we can cross live now to the Royal United Services Institute in London, where former Prime Minister Tony Blair, to mark the 9/11 anniversary, is also speaking about the situation, the current situation in Afghanistan.
The turning of the religion into a political doctrine, but in the justification of struggle, if necessary, armed struggle, to achieve it. Other Islamists agree with the ends but eschew violence. But the ideology itself is in inevitable conflict with open, modern, culturally tolerant societies. Nearly everything about 9/11 and its aftermath, particularly now, is mired in controversy. What cannot be seriously disputed, however, is that since 9/11, though thankfully there's been no further terrorist attack of that scale, radical Islam has not declined in force. What is disputed is why. Is radical Islam a coherent ideology which represents a first-order threat to our security? Or are we facing, despite some common themes, a series of disconnected security challenges, each of which require handling on its own terms based on local circumstances? Is Islamism a problem or only its manifestation in violent extremism? Is it akin, as I say, to revolutionary communism and must be countered by a combination of security and ideological measures over the long term? Or is that to overstate it, overestimate it, and thus perversely, as some would argue, by the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, to elevate its appeal rather than diminish its appeal? This is a fundamental strategic question, and it needs a clear answer. In my view, Islamism, both the ideology and the violence, is a first-order security threat, and unchecked, it will come to us, even if centered far from us, as 9/11 demonstrated. The analysis published recently by Dr. El-Badawi from my institute shows how the roots of Islamism stretch back over many decades, grew in strength long before 9/11, and it examines the links between the ideology and the violence. This is supplemented by the excellent analysis of the ulema state concept by Ahmed Kuru and by the annual report we publish of jihadist groups, which shows that this is a global challenge and one that is getting worse. The ideology, whether Shia promulgated by the Islamic Republic of Iran or Sunni promoted by groups on a spectrum from the Muslim Brotherhood through to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram and many others, has been the principal cause of destabilization across the Middle East and beyond, and today in Africa. Like revolutionary communism, it operates in many different arenas and dimensions. And like it, its defeat will come ultimately through confronting both the violence and the ideology by a combination of hard and soft power. Now, if this is a correct analysis, then especially after the fall of Afghanistan, the leading powers must unite to develop an agreed strategy. And even if initial discussions center around Western nations, China and Russia also have an interest in countering this ideology, and our best allies are to be found in the many Muslim countries, including in the Middle East, desperate to retake their religion from extremism. We need also to assess our vulnerability. COVID-19 has taught us about deadly pathogens. Bioterror possibilities may seem like the realm of science fiction, but we would be wise now to prepare for their potential use by non-state actors. On the other hand, if this analysis is rejected, the alternative is, in effect, to say this is a second-order problem where we are directly threatened, we retaliate through counter-terrorism measures, drone strikes, surveillance, special forces, but otherwise we leave alone. But if this is where policy is heading, we have to understand it to its limitations. We need to work out what we mean by not remaking countries from which terrorist threats can arise. I understand it means that we do not do what we tried to do in Afghanistan. The one thing should be understood. Our remaking didn't fail because the people didn't want the country remade. For sure, we could have remade better. But Afghans did not choose the Taliban takeover. The last opinion poll in 2019 showed the Taliban with 4% support amongst the Afghan people. They conquered the country by violence, not persuasion. The barrier to nation building is usually not the people, but poor institutional capacity and governance, including corruption, over many years. And most of all, the challenge of trying to build whilst internal elements combined with external support are trying to destroy. But counter-terrorism on its own won't remove an entrenched threat. We could seek a middle course. For example, in the Sahel, we could adopt a strategy of assisting countries with security, but also supporting the government's own attempts to develop their nations, because poverty and underdevelopment undoubtedly facilitate the extremists. In a way, this is what we did in Afghanistan post-2014, when NATO's mission went to train, advise, and assist. But even here, this will likely encompass more than conventional counter-terrorism. We need some boots on the ground. Naturally, our preference is for the boots to be local, but that will not always be possible. Western societies and their political leaders have become, quite understandably, deeply averse to casualties amongst our armed forces. This is not a problem for the armed forces themselves, who are brave and extraordinary people, but it is now an overwhelming political constraint to any commitment to Western boots on the ground except for special forces. Yet the problem this gives rise to is obvious. If the enemy we're fighting knows that the more casualties they inflict, the more our political will erodes, then the incentive structure is plain. There is an additional challenge for Europe and NATO. It is clear now, if it wasn't before, that America has decided that for the foreseeable future, it is a very limited appetite for military engagement. After Kosovo, I initiated European defence with France. I did this precisely because I realised that without the United States, and indeed President Clinton's commitment, we could never have resolved the crisis. And today, the Balkans, relative to its history, can aspire to a peaceful future, hopefully within Europe. Yet the crisis was on Europe's doorstep, not America's. It's Europe that faces the immediate challenge from the destabilization of the Sahel. Europe is already facing the fallout from Libya, Syria, and elsewhere in the Middle East. And for these purposes, Britain is part of Europe, like it or not. So how do Europe and NATO develop the capability to act when America is unwilling? Answering these questions, at least confronting them, would also reinvigorate Western policymakers' capacity to think strategically. For me, one of the most alarming developments of recent times has been the sense that the West has lost its capacity to formulate strategy, that its short-term political imperatives have simply squeezed the space for long-term thinking. It is this sense, more than anything else, in my judgment, which gives our allies anxiety and our opponents a belief that our time is over. One of the most depressing things I've heard regularly articulated over the past weeks is the idea that we are foolish in believing that Western notions of liberal democracy and freedom are exportable or will ever take root except in the somewhat decadent terrain of Western society. Now, maybe my generation of leaders were naive in thinking countries could be remade, or maybe the remaking needed to last longer. But we should never forget, as we see the women of Afghanistan in the media, culture, and civic society now flee in fear of their lives, that our values are still those which free people choose. Recovering confidence in those values and in their universal application is a necessary part of ensuring we stand up for them and are prepared to defend them. Thank you very much.
Mr. Blair, thank you very much for your presentation. And I should say, for the benefit of journalists or people listening, that both the presentation and the discussion are on the record, so they could be quoted in any shape or form that is required. Mr. Blair, let me just start with a bit that you took as granted, namely your criticism about how we handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan over the last few weeks. You mentioned it at the beginning of your speech by saying, my views are known. You used a rather strong, sometimes one could argue even a bit spicy terminology in terms of criticizing the concept of the forever wars. Unpack it for us. Tell us why do you think that the concept is unhelpful or indeed harmful, as you suggested, to the debate on security questions?
I mean, the term or the phrase ending forever wars has been used by politicians of all political stripes, particularly in the United States. And let me say right at the very beginning, I have a deep respect for President Biden. I admire him and like him, and I agree with many of the things that he's trying to do. But not simply those in the Democrat Party, but those in the Republican Party who use this phrase. I think it is a deeply mistaken phrase because, number one, we haven't ended this war. Mm-hmm. We've ended our participation in it. Different concept. Number two, it's not forever. I mean, 20 years, for a lot of the groups we're fighting, 20 years for them is not a long time. And, if you take the revolutionary communism analogy, we stayed with that for 60, 70 years or more. But finally, the rhythm of what we were doing post-2014 and saying by the end of 2019 was obviously completely different from what we were doing in the 2005, 2006, 2007, and in the years after the big problems arose in Afghanistan. So I just think it's not a good way of making policy, because in the end it's a political slogan. It's not really based on an analysis of the threat and the strategy to counter it.
Understood. I have the benefit of talking to you before this event, so in a way I know you're thinking, but I just wonder if you could tell us, the proposition that is now being put by a lot of people, including the American president, that we should have gone in, smash Al-Qaeda, get bin Laden, which by the way took 10 years, and somehow get out and leave the pieces to the others. Is it something you would have been able to sell to the British public in 2001?
I think it's quite important. It's a good question, because it's quite important to go back and just relive the events of 9/11. I haven't seen it yet, but I gather there's quite a good documentary done by the BBC about that day and the events and the decisions that were taken, at least by the American president, President Bush at that time. I don't think people would have felt a response that was merely about going and trying to deal with Al-Qaeda and getting back out again. I don't think people would have found that acceptable at the time. I mean, things change, obviously, over time. But in any event, I don't think you can deal with these groups when they're entrenched simply by counter-terrorism measures. I just don't think it's possible. I mean, they hold territory. You know, they build capacity. And the one thing that is very clear about them is that they're prepared to take large numbers of casualties. I mean, in the work my institute does, I mean, when you look even at the years 2017, 2018, you know, and you look around the world, the numbers of people that died at the hands of the extremists is large, but the numbers of extremists themselves who died is even larger. But it hasn't stopped them growing and proliferating, and they will continue to do so. And I think one of the things that's most difficult is for us to get our heads around the elements of this that are to do with genuine religious conviction. Now, it may be completely misguided, but it is a genuine religious belief that has been turned into this political ideology. And the interesting thing about the work that my institute's done, and I really recommend the paper by Dr. Al-Badawi, who works with my institute, on the roots of Islamism, and also the work by Amit Kuru on the...
So former Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair, there at the Royal United Services Institute, delivering a speech marking the anniversary of 9/11, but also dealing with the current situation in Afghanistan. One of the points that he made was that our best allies, referring to the West, our best allies can be found, he said, in many countries, including in the Middle East, desperate to take back control of their religion from extremists.